Welcome back, everybody, to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin with my co-host and co-conspirator, Mike Sauter. How's it, Mike?
Good. Isn't this time of year? I'm sure our guest feels the same way from merry old England. But this time of year, May, June, all my kids are grown up. You know, it used to be every school recital, everything. But there's something in the air that even makes me, my youngest graduates from college this weekend, St. Bonaventure University. And that's really the only formal thing. But it must be muscle memory that we think May. I've heard in 12-step groups, I've heard it's Mother's Day is the biggest day for relapses on the calendar here. Yep.
I never heard that. Now,
isn't that just an interesting phenomenon? Yeah, I think
May
gets. Yep. Go ahead.
We were supposed to have our May festival, our May Day. We were originally planning on it for May Eve, but it was so cold and it was rainy. It was horrible. So I postponed it for a week, and we did it just this past weekend on the 6th.
Oh, good.
Which was lovely. And it was,
ladies and gentlemen, Michael Martin single-handedly regenerating the festivals in
That's
America.
Right.
Yeah.
And this time I'm leaving the maypole up permanently. Because we have woods. I usually take down a small tree just to make room for the other ones to grow. But this time I decided we'd leave it up permanently in the pasture.
We have the biggest maypole in England in Nottinghamshire.
Nice.
Wow.
Yeah.
How tall is it, Alison?
Oh, 20 feet.
Yep.
Okay.
That's what mine was.
It's very, very tall.
Mine was about that tall. I had to cut it down a bit because I didn't have enough ribbon to add on to our extant ribbons. But anyway, So here we are. Another thing happened in the last week
Tell me about it.
My anniversary, my birthday, and my anniversary, which comes the day after, and
there she is.
Totally pertains to what we're going to be talking about.
Saint Bridget, yeah. And what is
Saint
who made
Bridget.
it for you, Michael? Yeah, I see.
How do you know it's Saint Bridget, Mike?
I see the cross that essentially I saw the cross. Yeah.
But she's also holding a bishop's crook.
Oh wow, right.
Right.
So it was kind of moving. You were doing your
legend
job.
has
Alison
it,
and I
right?
were struggling to see all the deets.
I know. Sorry about that. It's horrible.
She's an abbess, I suppose.
Yeah, there we go.
She was an abbess, but there's a legend that she was also a bishop. If you've heard that. That's at least that's the scuttlebutt.
I'm going to pass it on. I'm sure people are going to be interested.
Not a lot of people know about this. You got to know the right people.
I'm going to yell out my window to the college kids walking by and say, "Hey!"
But anyway,
I got some inside track.
I am so happy to finally speak to Alison Milbank in real time, if not in person. And Alison, I'm going to read off her credits here. And now she's the perfect person to talk to. I mean, I have a story, as I always do. But Alison is an Anglican priest and canon theologian of the Southwell Minster. Is that in Nottingham or is it in Southwell?
No, it's in the country, about 14 miles. It's a cathedral in a village.
Okay. She's also a professor of theology and literature at the University of Nottingham. And that's basically what I was before Mary Grove folded. Her most recent book, and tell me, I think this is right, is God in the Gothic? Is still the most recent? Religion, Romance, and Realism in the English Literary Tradition. I mean, this is speaking my language right here. And this is from your note from a couple of years ago. And at that time, and tell me if it's still true, Alison was working on a genealogy of divine eminence in Anglican natural philosophy and poetry, which is why we can safely say Alison Milbank is my soulmate.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean,
that's basically what I do, right? Yeah. In fact, so here's the story.
You could both redefend your dissertations to each other.
We should. Yeah. Well, that's speaking of my dissertation and Alison's work. A few years ago, I asked her to contribute a piece for the Jesus the Imagination on the Divine Feminine. Mm-hmm. And she graciously provided me with an essay called Oiling the Wheels of the Heavenly Chariot, Female Priesthood and the Divine Feminine, which the title intrigued me. And of course, she starts with an epigraph from John Portage. You know, a lot of people don't know who John Portage was, or the Philadelphian Society, or Thomas Bromley, or Jane Lead. And it makes me very sad because this was such an important moment in 17th century English religion and literature. And the Philadelphian Society, they were deeply inspired by Jakob Burma. And they were a phenomenon. It was just amazing what happened with this group. And when I opened up her file and she sent me the essay, it was the first thing that hit me was John Portage. And I said, okay, I'm in, right? You had me at John Portage. And in fact, we should someday in the future have a show on the Philadelphian Society, because
Absolutely.
not enough people know about the Philadelphian Society. And I wrote a chapter in my dissertation on Jane Lead, comparing her. And my angle was that Jane Lead is the St. Paul of her community, because two of her associates, her disciples, took on names of St. Paul's disciples, Timothy and Onesius. And I was, that's what they were doing. So she was St. Paul then, which is absolutely pertains to one of our topics today. We'll talk with Alison today about being a woman and being a priest, but also about the idea of a parish, and that in England right now, probably across the UK, I imagine, is a Save the Parish Movement. We'll talk a little bit about that. And
Wow,
Mike,
so cool.
Mike's, and that speaks exactly to what Mike does for a living, right?
Yeah, Alison, I'm a layman, but I'm the head of my local parish, which is 5 former country parishes. Sometimes bringing those churches to work together, we're giving the few number of remaining priests, the equivalent of nervous breakdown. So the bishop twice has asked me to run it, and I'm always trying to, again, and I've read a lot of your work. It's a fascinating conversation, because we all agree that the model of community that's needed to rebuild culture, to regenerate, it has to be of a certain scale and a certain size, and it has to have some autonomy. This will be fantastic.
So to begin with, Alison, I wonder if you could describe your biographical journey toward the priesthood. How does that happen?
Well, when I was a little girl, when there were no female priests, I used to play at baptisms, and I had a little altar on my linen basket. But although I wanted to read theology and become a kind of lay minister, my priest said to me, "No, they'll make you a doormat. Don't do it." So I went off and did other things. But then when I gave birth, I suddenly felt I was in quite a working class town at the time, where people used to throw things at our window.
Wow.
We didn't have net curtains, and we had books, and they didn't like books. So you can imagine how kind of alien as an academic you felt. But becoming a mother, I suddenly felt really, really close to the other mothers on the ward in the hospital. And I felt this sense of responsibility for all children in the world, which I think young parents do suddenly feel. You're no longer an individual, you're already somehow wanting to represent, to intercede, to care. And it was out of breastfeeding my daughter at night and praying that I felt a call to priesthood, which was it then possible? No, it still wasn't possible. And I don't know that I completely articulated it as that then, but that it was the priestly impulse to represent, to wish to care for, to intercede, to mediate, that I felt called to. And it was out of that maternal urging that I finally made it to the priesthood after about 4 different selection processes, because we kept moving. And every time we moved to America, I had to start from scratch. And then we moved
Oh.
back to England and I had to start again because it was too long from the first. I'm very selected.
Now it's interesting that you connect that your vocation to your motherhood, because as you know, our patron here, Saint Bridget, is the patron saint of midwives.
You never asked me if she was going to be our patron, but I concur. If you just want
Well,
to,
actually, she's the patron
like
of
I was
our
never
house.
consulted. Oh,
She's
okay.
the patron of our house church. I should have qualified.
Gotcha. Okay. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm an
She's the
easygoing
patron
guy.
of my house. Yeah. But and that's what struck me when I read your essay when you sent it, and I think I told you before. And I have read many beautiful essays submitted to Jesus' imagination, but only one brought tears to my eyes, and it was yours. Truly. And it was just that because, growing up in the Catholic Church, and now that was funny. I was thinking about this just yesterday. So I look back to my childhood and in my youth. If you would have asked me if my family were liberal or conservative, I couldn't have told you. I had it didn't register in those days. I don't know. I don't think they could answer if I asked them either. And so growing up in the Catholic Church at that time, so in the 1970s, I think I left in 1980 for a while, that the idea of a female priesthood was out there, was percolating in the culture, but I never got it, because it always seemed like, the angry feminist version of we can do it too. I didn't see what the point was, because of how gender couldn't figure into it. And I was disappointed in that the way it's usually presented, it has absolutely turns me off, because it's very political and it's not spiritual at all. But when I read Alison's essay here, I finally understood. And it wasn't that I had to be convinced. It was as though these were feelings I already had, but I had never been able to articulate it. You know why? Because I'm not a woman. That's why. But you put it into such a beautiful context that so how does that work out in your life and in your actually profession as a priest?
I mean, I think I said in the essay that there are two dimensions to priesthood. There's the standing in the place of Christ at the altar, and there's the representing of the people, the motherhood of the church.
Right.
And I believe very strongly that the whole church offers the Eucharist, and the priest is the one through whom who sort of presides over the whole offering of the church. And I suppose that I feel that Mother Church, if you like, is particularly imaged by the woman priest, just as the personhood of Christ is particularly imaged by male priests. Though I represent Christ because I've been baptized, and they represent Mother Church, but obviously visually, as a visual icon, that side of it is brought out. And I feel it particularly strongly when I baptize children, because obviously I take them in my arms as I would my own children. I bathe them, I put oil on them, I clothe them, I dry them. Kind of,
it's about as motherly as it gets,
strongly.
right there. Yeah.
That kind of side of what you're doing comes out very powerfully, and I make the most of it, because the Anglican Church will baptize anyone who presents themselves, because that's our role as the established church. And anyway, Jesus welcomed children, so jolly well not going to turn them away. But it does mean that to use these enacted visual symbols is quite powerful, to tie in with the ordinary experience of the parents,
Mhm.
So that's how it particularly works itself out. I mean, I would say that people who thought that having women priests would make everything more radical and non-hierarchical and all this kind of thing, women priests can be just as clerical, just as stuffy, just as power-driven
Yeah.
as men.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things what I've noticed over the years. I mean, John has called me a feminist theologian. Shout out, John. But one of the things I've noticed over my life is the kind of trajectory of feminism, which it seems there's a turn, which I really like, that is turning toward a more feminine feminism. Whereas what you saw for the longest time was the gender neutral feminine, trying to neutralize gender, which I think I think a lot of the problems we see in the culture right now are directly attributable to exactly that thing.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, don't tell me, don't tell me what we're facing is not this assembly line version of gender, right? Where it's just a matter of replacing parts or retrofitting.
Well,
What
it's
we
because I think you're not allowed to value the feminine as such, because we
Right.
now live in this kind of, sort of gender critical kind of world. It makes it paradoxically difficult to actually own any kind of qualities or virtues or any specificity to masculinity or femininity, which is ironic. But
Yeah.
I grew up in girls' schools, a women's college, and that kind of tradition makes you proud of feminine community, feminine virtues, even while I was at a women's college in Cambridge where we were taking on men at their own kind of
Right.
intellectual game, but we were very proud to be women. And I think it's that kind of formation that's allowed me, because I'm older, paradoxically, you're right that there was this kind of sort of very capitalist form, if you like.
It is exactly what it is. Yeah.
There was, when I was in, I think it was like 25 to 30 years ago, I was just taking a master's in theology at this grad school. And that was the total question, right? If we had a talk, it was on grieving or women priesthood, like if you wanted to draw a big audience. Kubler-Ross had been out for a while, but those were just happened to be the subjects. But I remember, because it seemed so tainted with the issues of power, that I didn't really have an entrance point. I knew I wanted to retain something. So I don't know if I remember researching, but I remember being drawn to, something that just gucked up the machine a little bit was Teresa of Lisieux, feeling she's called to many things, one of which was priesthood. So for Catholics, that was just okay, can we talk about this? The other one was, I think the name was Tina Beatty, but wrote an article on a British theologian, wrote an article on the priesthood of Mary. And I thought, like, in offering her son, I thought, okay, we're getting there. The other one was the great, the phenomenal, we should do a show on her, the great anthropologist, Mary Douglas. She, at that time, she had an article in Commonweal magazine that she was, and this is for some reason, because I've always just been allergic to power, right? And you could smell the power grab in all the discussions, not all of them. Oh, certainly all the discussions. I can't claim to go into any person's heart, but so many of the discussions were just based on power. So Mary Douglas proposed that with her work in cultural anthropology, at least for the time being, she was leaving the male priesthood, but she was looking for female cardinals, to say that cardinals need necessarily be priests, and you can start getting women to kind of shift up. And I thought that was interesting. I'm not trying to take that farther than it needs to go. The last cardinal I think we had in the Catholic Church that wasn't a priest was Cardinal Richelieu. So it's not like a great a legacy. We're not like standing on the shoulder of giants in that regard. But we're all in agreement that we're trying to tease some of this stuff apart. And Alison, I concur. I've written a lot for Michael's journal, and that was it was a great article. The fact that you call yourself a priestess. I'm not trying to box you in with that, but it kind of frees up some of the stuff that I think is so intrinsically important.
Yeah, and before we move on a little bit, let's show the cover of Jesus' imagination. This is the artwork is by a German digital collage artist, Katrin Welstein. Now, we had a committee meeting about this, my wife and my oldest daughter and myself, about which picture because Katrin sent me quite a few different images, but they said this one.
I like it.
Because it's got the fetus there. That's divine, the divine feminine right there, right? And that's the part. I mean, that's the mystery, right? It's the central mystery of human life and of the well, I shouldn't say the central, but it's a mystery of the feminine, right? That this happens, and it's such a sacred thing. I mean, I have 9 children, and one of them is in the house. I hope she comes by because she's a big Alison Milbank fan. And I told her I was talking to you today. She said, "Oh, I was just thinking about that essay yesterday." I said, "Well, maybe come and say hi." But and speaking of midwives, we've had most of our children at home with a midwife, and I think I even caught 2 of them as they came out, but I don't remember because
I can concur that I just don't remember that moment.
I think I did,
yeah,
but I don't remember because it's a different place altogether. The only thing I compare the birth of a child to is death, actually. Because actually in this room where I am right now, my mother died back in November, and it was beautiful because we were all there, and I had never been present while somebody died. I'd been there right afterwards, but it was in fact, we as my mother we knew she only had minutes left. My sister said, "Mike, we have to pray." So what did I grab? I grabbed the Book of Common Prayer, which happened to be right next to me, and we read from the burial service. And it was one of the most beautiful moments and that I've seen. But I think that because this is idea of in midwifery, right, is guiding people into life, and I think there's something in this idea of the priestess or the feminine priesthood, which is precisely that, and you articulate it so beautifully. Now, here's the thing, though. What do your colleagues think about your opinions on this?
Well, I haven't actually preached on the priesthood, if you're with me. You don't really get an opportunity to preach on the priesthood. I think my colleagues at the university think it's very odd that I'm the only person who's ever been a priest who is an academic in their department who's put reverend by their university handle. And I do that quite deliberately because I do feel that I'm a priest in my academic work, and that the midwifery, if you like, is bringing, the whole person to their full human flourishing. And although obviously I'm not allowed to evangelize, I am teaching religion and literature. And as you know, you can't teach Dante's Commedia without people in some sense kind of performing it, without them kind of entering into that imaginative world. So I can, with kind of integrity, draw them as far as I can, if you like, birth them as much as I can into an understanding of what it is like to lead a life of faith, a world in which God is real, which everything is real. So my colleagues have never told me off for doing that and being kind of quite overt. I always start the classes by saying, you have to take into account the fact that I'm a Christian and that I'm a priest. So, you can...
Right. Now, so let's go to your other colleagues. What about the colleagues in the church? What do they think about the idea of, could you be at a meeting and say, you know what, I think we should call women priestesses?
They'd hate it. The evangelicals would hate it. Well, they're not very keen on priests anyway, but they would associate it with pagan priestesses.
Yeah, right.
It was something screwy. And Anglo-Catholics are, in terms of kind of gender politics, very liberal indeed these days.
Mhm.
So I don't know how they would respond. I'd have to be feeling very brave, because it's really not. I do remember in the days when I used to go to Anglo-Catholic congresses, somebody actually saying to me, well, if they called themselves priestesses, I would consider it. Because obviously there is still the Catholic movement in the Church of England is still split right down the middle between people who will not receive, not just receive women's ministry, but won't be ordained by somebody who is contaminated. I'm quite relaxed about all that. It doesn't kind of fuss me personally. It doesn't bother me.
Right.
But I think many of the women priests would feel that I was somehow not, I was somehow not making them equal in some way, you know, just the way that some women like to be actors, not actresses. But I'm very proud to say that my women's college, Girton, even though it's now become mixed, still has a mistress at the head, not a master. Whereas there were lots of female masters knocking around Cambridge and Oxford.
Yeah, this is a simple political take, but it's just the fact that what you're saying, Alison, is seen as, in so much common parlance, as conservative still drives me nuts. Because to me, again, this dynamism between the genders, you know, that is the thing. You know, that's what moves it forward. And the fact that when we, you know, we're constantly reminding people with our friend like Guido Preparata, you know, in an ants heap, there's no male nor female in that sense, right? There's just breeders, workers. And, you know, if the so-called progressives, if the so-called people on the right side of history want to turn us into an ant heap, that's fine. But ant heaps, we just had 2 nukes of bees come yesterday, Mike. You know, it doesn't seem like, yeah, but you know, it just grates on my nerves that you could be seeing, you know, that they think that's like backward. And I just think it's the poetry is the only forward way to go. And I don't mean to ossify that and say like every woman who's called to priesthood need call herself a priestess. And I'm not trying to like come top down on that. But the fact that when we look at the gender and we try and bring in poetry, that's where any progress in the world is going to come from. And the other one just looks like a machine, and our terminology is just all screwed up.
Wow, interesting you mentioned your bees, Mike, because first of all, you're reminding me I have to go out and check on mine. I think I have to pull some honey. But just yesterday on Twitter, some people I know were having just this conversation about whether or not the beehive is a sociological image. And of course it is, right?
Yeah.
And I've written about it a little bit too much. I get a little obsessed, but it's important. And I think, as Alison mentioned, keep calling the head of the school the head mistress, the mistress of the school is important. I remember back in the 80s, I was there. You ever hear of co-masonry? It's like Freemasonry with girls. It is.
I don't know.
So,
I don't know.
it was actually it's kind of I think an outgrowth of the Theosophical movement in the late 1800s. And the funny thing is, even back then, I don't know what they're doing now. They were calling both men and women brother.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, isn't that kind of stupid? Can't we just say what things really are? Do it. And as we said before, and I think it's I don't know. I don't know about you, but I've noticed over the last few months that it seems like the end game of feminism is patriarchy, as we've seen more and more former men become the best women at the job. You know, whether it was Caitlyn Jenner getting Woman of the Year after 6 months on the job, just absurd. But the other thing is, you know, nobody wants. When people talk about gender equity, and I don't want to get too off track, they're always talking about the power jobs, right? The bankers and politics. They're never. We just the garbage collectors just came by. No women, and I've seen almost. I don't think I've seen one female garbage collector in my life, right?
We just had 2 women put blacktop on our driveway the other day. 2 women, 2 guys. It was awesome. They worked super.
I have hired women when I had a landscaping business. I hired women. But but that's never the conversation, right? The conversation is where the money and the power are, right? Which is disgusting. Which is, those are things Michael and I oppose, which is why I'm really interested in this idea of a kind of, you could say reimagining, but I would say reclaiming the feminine in the precincts of the church. And I mean, church broadly, right?
Church broadly, yeah.
I mean, in the Catholic and the Orthodox, as well as the Anglican and other Protestant denominations, right? But I would love to see it reclaimed as feminine and not as gender neutral.
I mean, I think it also does have implications for a hallowing of the laity as well. I mean, in the book For the Parish that I wrote with Andrew Davison, I had a kind of theology of mission where I see the priesthood of the laity as, dealing with babies or engines or computers or garbage as the stuff of the earth, and showing its link to God and its holiness. And that this, one shouldn't have a view, I mean, obviously I am a person with a Catholic view of priesthood, but I hope it's not a clericalist one. And it's one which should help to reveal the priesthood of all believers and the priestly actions of lay people in their ordinary lives. Because one of the problems with feminism is, yes, you want the power, you want to be able to work, and I'm not trying to stop poor women working, but if you're working at the, you are working and being all powerful while employing poor women to look after your children and do your laundry, that does not seem to me a particularly feminist action.
Well, yeah. And
it should be one that raises everybody. And similarly in priesthood, I don't want this to be at the expense of not honoring flower arrangers or people who make the tea. Or
right.
That anecdote, Alison, is so crucial. I just want to highlight that, that the idea that the movement is taking place at one level, and then you still have the underpaid work. I just want to single that out, that, you see different people, cultural critics bring that up, but it's so damning. And I don't mean, that it damns the whole movement, that there's nothing good from it, but exactly what you said. I wish it raised more questions than it does. People just see that and they look the other way. It's always been disheartening to me, because I don't look at it as an apologetics point to put down all movements for women's liberation or anything, but it's a systemic problem. It's a systemic problem. Michael, I cut you off.
Well, that's what Mary Harrington has come to attention recently. She's been talking about that. And I think she's right on the money. In fact, there was a short video she did for Unheard, maybe 20 minutes long, 15 minutes long, maybe not even that, where she was talking about contraceptive birth control being the not only the beginning of transhumanism, but the beginning of commodification of women, right? So we talked earlier about how it becomes a kind of a capitalist end game, and we see that all over the place now. And I showed it to my students, and the girls in the class were relieved, because I said, "What do you guys think? What do you think of this?" And they were relieved to hear it articulated, because they're living in a world far different from the dating world we lived in. I always tell them, I said, when I was your age, I just, I didn't expect anything from a woman. I felt I had to earn her. So I'd write poetry or, slay a dragon or whatever, right? And they're like, "Oh, that's so cute, Professor Martin." It's not like that? You mean it's not like that anymore? I said,
one quick anecdote on that, and maybe I told it last week, and I really apologize if I did, but it was a great philosophy professor here. Actually, philosophy and literature. His specialty was like Stendhal and others, but they were talking about the role of jealousy, right? As opposed to envy. Envy, you have to put other people down. Jealousy, you have this beautiful thing, and this trust you have. So maybe 20 students, a lot of them seemed well adjusted, but none of them there had an entrance point into this discussion of love and jealousy, except one student, and it broke my heart, said, "Oh, it's about this video game I guess I'm jealous of somebody who hasn't learned this video game yet, because they can have the joy of learning it, which I already have, if that makes sense. That was the only entrance point to that whole world. And I thought, like, what more evidence do we need of the apocalypse?
That's right. Take me now, Jesus.
Yeah.
Right.
A love was the love of falling into a world called Skyrim, or some, video game universe or something.
Oh,
And I just thought, like, all the wind was taken out of my sails. So apocalyptic was that. And the thing is, he said it with so much affect. He was wistful, and that somebody else could have that joy of falling in love with it. It broke my heart because of the powerful affect, almost like tears in his eyes about the joy of this video game. It's like we're going to be hearing about blow-up dolls in the same way very soon.
oh, help me. So anyway, so actually, Alison mentioned your book. Was it Saving the Parish? Is that what it's called?
The old book is For the Parish. There's a new one coming out called The Once and Future Parish.
Oh, I love that title.
Even more unpopular.
So let's talk about the parish.
Yeah.
And why it needs, why should it be saved? And how, no, seriously, I mean,
give us the whole backstory, Alison. Tell us,
like
give us the theme. Yeah.
Well, your audience may need to know that in England, where I live, by the Norman period, the whole place was divided up into parishes, and this survived the Reformation. And in the Church of England, traditionally, there was a priest to a parish, and that priest had the cure of souls to be responsible for everybody and everything, you might say, I would, in terms of the nature, the ecological aspect of it, within that geographical area. Over recent years, country churches like the one that you described, Mike, have been gathered together in groups. But the Church of England, for some years, has really kind of given up. Obviously, there's been a period of great decline in numbers of people worshipping. But going along at the same time, the Church of England is really, among its hierarchy, lost confidence in Anglican practices, Anglican orders, Anglican liturgy, and any sense that these are missional tools. They're now called inherited church. And so at the moment, for example, in the Diocese of Leicester, they're about to make what used to be 26 parishes are to become one unit.
Huh.
There will be 4 paid people, one of whom will be an administrator, one of whom will be a clergy person. The other 2 probably, they hope, probably will be lay people. And how can a parish, which is all about the diversity of the people in that area, being the people of God, being a liturgical community, celebrating the Eucharist together every week, how on earth that is going to be possible, God only knows. Yeah. Now, their argument is one of scarcity, but at the same time, the church commissioners have put 176 million pounds into things like resource churches, where you drench a particular church, which you often buy something like an old Chinese restaurant or something, and you give them 8 clergy, 4 apprentices, several administrators, and they do a Holy Trinity Brompton style kind of soft rock plus a talk. And that's where a lot of the money is going, because that they feel is the way forward. Now, they're supposed to have got 89,000 new converts out of this, and they've only got 11,000, so it's not working. Mm-hmm. But that's the way things are going. There is no value being put. They claim they all love the parish, but then where they put their money and the way they talk, they now want there to be an equal number of new worshipping communities as there are parishes, so that people can find the style that suits them, as if, or a brand of cereal in a supermarket.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of situation in England as I speak.
Wow.
Depressing, right? You know, there's one thing, since we all contributed to the Journal on the Divine Feminine, you know, the literature on the underworld, for whatever it's worth, and I think it's worth a whole lot, is one thing we learn about that with you know, when David Bentley Hart was on his novel that had, you know, the divine feminine asleep, you know, this is ubiquitous, this type of mythology, is that the underworld and the divine feminine is inherently local. It's tied, you know, and this is, you know, I beat a drum on the anxiety epidemic and so forth, but this is so needed in our time, a connection to the real and the local, so that people feel they have a sense of obligation and a connection. So you know, just at a time when I think that with the turn of the decline of maybe Faustian culture and something new, you know, we're taking our eyes off kind of the old inherited hierarchies and the sky gods. We could be getting connected. And then you have kind of nefarious movements like this that just like muck the whole thing up, right? So it's the betrayal of the local is a version of the betrayal of the divine feminine.
Well, that's one of the things that Peter Morin of the Catholic Workers said. Everybody's church is nobody's church, right? And that
Great one. I never heard that.
I mean, it's been going. Maybe what you're seeing there, Alison, is like what we had here in the United States for the longest time, especially in Protestant churches, where they make it glitzy. They try to make it glitzy, thinking the kids will come in, right? And the kids might wander in and wander out right away. There's nothing there to hold them. And this is actually when we started years ago. Remember, Mike? We had the Radical Catholic Reimagination of Everything conference at my farm.
Epic conference.
It's it was 2017, so it's a while.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But that's what the whole point of that was, and actually everything I've been doing is how do you make it that the children will stay, right? You know, how do you form a community that's not paranoid?
Yeah.
That, you know, because so often in these like Christian homeschool groups or something, there's a real bunker mentality, and it creeps me out. And how can we find something that's vital and living and human that will hold people together? And I think the idea of the parish, my patron saint in this regard, I am sure. And I have the Bible in my left hand and Robert Herrick on the right.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because that's the idea right there. It's a mess. I mean, his community, which this is a cultural study of his parish. It's a holy mess too, because there's a little bit of everything. There's a little folk religion. There's Latin paganism, there's Catholicism, there's Anglicanism, there's annoying people in the parish that he writes epigrams about. There's all kinds of stuff.
Numerically, they could save time if they talked about the unannoying people in the parish. But this is just another way of saying how delightful it is.
Well, in my book, what book is it? Incarnation of the Poetic Word. I have a chapter on Herrick and Little Gidding. And the point being, people just, when they try to analyze Robert Herrick's Hesperides, they say it's really not really an organized work. No, it's disorganization is its organization. That's the whole point of it, right? And I was mentioning to Mike earlier, you did a few videos for Nottingham on certain aspects of celebrating the Christian year. And the one that really stands out in my memory is the one you did with Tom Laughlin on Lammas.
Oh, yes.
It's beautiful.
I love Lammas, and I'm a great believer in the environmental crisis is, for me, the big opportunity to reconnect people to where their food comes from and to render this liturgical. I did a whole loaf to feed 150 people, and we did offer it at the altar. It would have been better if it had actually come from local corn, but you can't, it was just a beginning.
Yes.
But I mean, you can do this just as much in towns because everybody depends on the land. It doesn't matter where you live. In my parish, I was a curator. They have something called Cowslip Sunday. which dates from the May practices where people used to walk up from Nottingham to buy cowslips from the local girls. And then the men would go to the pub and the women and children went to church. And they had a local hymn based on little local landmarks and dumbles, which are these steep-sided clay stream cuttings. They had cowslip vestments. And while I was there, the vicar rebirthed the whole thing, but according to a kind of ecological principle, so that you went up planting cowslips on Cowslip Sunday. But, you know, we also, you know, we did baptisms in the stream and all sorts of ways in which you can connect people back to the local, to the ecological, to understanding how everything kind of works together.
Right.
And this thing about, okay, yeah. I was just thinking, and kind of an underappreciated, and I don't think it's every Marian apparition, is that disproportionately these happen at solar noon, right, which is local time. You know, that again, a connection between the divine feminine and the local, that you're going to look for at Fatima, you're going to look for her at solar noon, which has nothing to do with the clock. And I find the poetry of that so powerful too, because everything you're describing, you know, the local, Alison, the local, and you know, this is where the regeneration is going to come from. Right.
And how often the Virgin appears in a tree or something like that, right?
Yeah, and the importance of springs and things. Yeah.
And now I think, Alison, you mentioned something I think it's profoundly important. I mean, this is, you know, I kind of organize my life around this principle, is that I think what happened, I think the ecological crisis is intimately related to the church's disenfranchisement from nature over the course of the Industrial Revolution in particular, and the urbanization of the church. Because people, you know, when the church became disconnected from the cosmos, everybody else became disconnected. Everything became disconnected from the cosmos. So the only way I think the only way to remedy that is, and I've been writing about this for a long time, is to reconnect, and not just to, I mean, I think the one thing is that people think, you know, often accuse me of being a medievalist in some way, but I think it's really a matter of not going backwards to the medieval era, but going forward and whatever that looks like to reunite ourselves with the church year and the agricultural year for me.
I think the one avenue of approach I think would be productive for the church. Now I'd be curious as to your thoughts, Alison, is that you know, because you're 100% right, Michael, where the church kind of like dropped the ball. On the other hand, right now, the environmental movement, you know, and Paul Kingsnorth was good on this, you know, it's been hijacked by a technocratic approach. And I think symbolically, the church could kind of stake its tent on the distinction between Earth Day and Arbor Day, right? My friend Bill Kaufman, a localist writer, a friend of Wendell Berry's, he was, you know, making kind of a belated case for Arbor Day. You know, on Earth Day, you send a fax in triplicate to a UN representative on the issue of global warming. On Arbor Day, you plant a tree, right? And I mean, but there's so much there. There's so much there. And we don't have to run down Earth Day, but we need, in the church, we need to separate our concern for creation from the technocratic approach that runs according to the same laws as what we were talking with Alison about with gender, right? You know, harnessing everybody to the giant machine. And, you know, and they're celebrated a couple days apart. But who do you know did anything for like Earth Day that could be, that had poetry to it? You know, it's usually protests and things like that.
I threw soup on a Van Gogh. That's what I did.
Yeah. You know, but think of Vacho Lindsay's poetry on trees and so forth, you know, that the church could re-grab the concrete, springs, planting trees, seeds of cowslips going up a hill in procession. You know, and this seems to be, you've been so prophetic in this, Alison. Your thoughts on that, you know, those distinctions, are they important to you?
They're very important. And part of the problem with my church at the moment is that their response is to give everybody targets. It's a bit like the law in St. Paul. particularly if you're a little village church where it's very expensive to get ground pumps. They don't always work properly at churches, and so they're all just feeling anxious about that. Was what they should be doing is thinking in a much more connected way about local markets. I know that the Archbishop of Granada, the last Archbishop of Granada, Don Javier, there were real problems with olive growers in his area, and he actually provided cooperative markets so that they could sustain local growing of olives and find places where they could sell them for a fair price. I think we need to re-enchant economic relations, as well as, obviously we do things in the Church of England. There are wild churchyard movements and counting the numbers of species you've got in them. Some churches, my sister's parish church in Paulsgrove, they have church allotments, and you can grow food together, teach people to cook ordinary food, you can bring it up to the altar. I'm an Anglo Catholic, but I do not like the fact that we just use little bits of wafer for the Eucharist. I really would like to get back to a single, delicious, freshly baked loaf.
Yeah. Taste and see how good the Lord is. Well, okay.
Kind of plasticky.
It sounds so kind of obvious, but was it Coptic churches where they used to have an oven in the church, the Bethlehem? The place of bread, where you baked the bread, and the smell of it would kind of fill the place. We need ways to really make things much more real, much more physical, much more tied to their origins.
And to highlight again, and it ties into Michael's work, you spoke of so many natural things, Alison, and you also included in the economic. And to grab the economic, we have a friend on a lot who used to be at the Gregorian, Guido Preparata. I was in Italy with him last fall, but his working at the Vatican, they wanted nothing to do with it. It was perishable currencies, right? When all of a sudden hoarding becomes a problem in the economy, the church could be there with new economic ideas. The church, it's seeded that whole world. I mentioned how my youngest son is graduating, but St. Bonaventure, it's a small Catholic college. You have a theology course that's teaching one anthropology about persons in communion, but the whole school is dominated by the MBA program, which teaches ruthless competitive individualism, right? Yeah. So we have, and I want to say, I'm starting to get pretty animated that, the regenerated church of the future, until they can solve that competing anthropologies question, that, that they can countenance, that we can be one anthropology competitive. You mentioned scarcity before, Alison, that we can have one anthropology based on scarcity in one aspect of our life and another one just in those times when we enter the church doors. I want to say young people are calling us. They're holding their cards. They're saying, there's no way I'm coming in until you can resolve this problem. We need to envision that their bodies can't handle that identity crisis we're offering them. The hope would be so big. Having been turned into automatons themselves, the hope would be so big at entering the church, they would risk everything. Certainly not less than everything would be, to quote T.S. Eliot. But if they come into that, and then we slap them the minute they walk out the church doors to say, now, when you go home to your family, it's dog eat dog, go have a good time. That's a way I'm kind of framing the question of we either got to do something with this economic question or we're done. And I was so grateful that in addition to trees and cowslips, you brought in the market,
Obviously, it's very complex, but you can at least start at the local level to have just exchanges. And I mean, my husband, John Milbank and Adrian Pabst, in their book, The Politics of Virtue, also imagine how we can have virtuous markets. And I know there's somebody at Notre Dame in the business school who is actually trying to apply Catholic social teaching to a business program. So there are people around who are trying to think, how do we scale up from that? And it is complicated, but we do have to put John and Guido together, Mike.
because I'll just be honest, I think this guy, Guido Preparati, he's the greatest economic mind of our generation, the most prophetic on this. We've had him on 3 or 4 times, but yeah, him in conversation with John and Adrian and yourself, Alison.
Yeah. So I wanted to. So this is interesting. I mean, I asked a question about the parish. We got to economics almost right away.
That's
because
cool.
it's. I mean, and actually, it kind of. I'm gonna drop what do you call it? A trailer. Here comes the trailer for Jesus Imagination 7, The Household of Things, which will be out in the fall, and. That's the whole reason I put that one together for that theme is the household of things. It's the real economy. And this is what we're talking about. It's not GDP. And the
It's
thing
the
is,
oikos, the
yeah,
house,
the oikos.
economics.
And the parish, in a way, at least archetypally, is the centerpiece in a way of that kind of economy. You know,
I was just invited by my bishop this week. I'm currently running the parish. In 3 weeks, I've been invited to run the whole division in our diocese of because it's called pastoral ministries. But there's not, I hate going up the hierarchy, but I did think, if you could do something, it includes migrant ministry, it includes the cultural groups. But if some of this stuff, if sometimes you hate to go higher, because a favorite author of mine, the Stephen Vincent, said, power weakens as it grows, right? The person at the top of the hierarchy is worried that his secretary is out to get him. When you're low, I've always been at the lowest, so I can pick up a hitchhiker, and I have time. And so I'm worried, but if I can throw resources towards some of these economic questions, and bring the economy into the one right brain department left in the diocese, pastoral ministries, it's a goal, and I'm willing to die on that hill. And then work at Walmart when I get.
Well, yeah, I mean that, and that's interesting, Mike, because I have repeated criticisms of so-called distributists, because I'll get into a distributors group and I say, well, does anybody actually buy directly from a farmer or CSA? And no, we just go to Walmart. I'm like, so it's kind of it's cosplay then, right? I mean, there are people out there doing it.
They're too busy doing their Chesterton reenactments.
Yeah. Let's read the 4th chapter of The Hobbit one more time. I'm sorry, but it's interesting. The thing is, in fact, I just did this last week. Last Friday, I gave a lecture at the Detroit branch of the Theosophical Society on biodynamic farming. And people were pretty excited. In fact, people have been contacting me all week about it because they didn't know that you could have an agricultural method that was connected to the cosmos.
Really? Right? They didn't know about it?
No,
Gosh.
They didn't. Well, they had heard about it, but didn't really know how it actually worked.
Yeah.
So, which was nice. In fact, this morning, I got up with the sun, and before I came, and I had to take a shower because this time of the year, I even if I take a shower, I don't have time to shave. I have to get out and plant something. But I figured, Alison Milbank's on today. I'm going to shave for Alison.
You look good.
Very honored.
Yeah, Alison thanks you.
But I was planting onions this morning when I got up, and
Alison says your breath stinks like onions.
Yeah, it's.
That would be a good thing.
Okay, that's a word.
Yeah, I could smell. I've smelled worse. But this idea that and I think this is, and Guido himself has actually uses a biodynamic farm as an economic model, right? Because just like we're saying with Robert Herrick and the parish, that's the economic model, right? And because that economic model is simultaneously mindful of the creation and the creator. And without that, without that, this is look out the window. That's what you get, right? What we see in the media and in the world, that's what you get from a worldview disconnected from those two realities.
What signs of hope are you seeing, Alison? Oh, okay.
disconnect them from both, not just from
Yeah.
one of those realities, from both.
And I think it connects, Alison, what you understood Michael when he's talking about biodynamic farming. What signs of hope are you and John seeing? So that you're seeing your interest in the parish is so poetic, it's spot on, it's also practical. Do you see it as just a losing battle now, or are you seeing any kind of strong thrusts towards restoration, regeneration?
I do, when I go around parishes, see that if you have a priest of imagination and a pastoral heart, you can grow the church. I have seen examples. I do get great heart from the Save the Parish movement itself, which is a lay movement. There are, okay, it's got a priest, Marcus Walker, at its head, and Angela Tilby is another priest who's involved, but there are hardly any priests involved. They're all too scared. But the lay people really inspire me, because they're the people on the ground who are actually keeping the show on the road, who are visiting the sick, who are kind of running services, running parishes sometimes, like yourself. And they give me hope, because they are at the bottom and they believe in what they're doing. And that does give me hope.
Are you seeing young people in that movement too? Is it appealing to younger demographics? Is it?
It does in the world of the post-liberal.
Okay.
Because of my son's generation, he thinks that there are 20% of young people who are not happy with the world as we have it, both in terms of sort of social politics, economic politics, who are hungering for mystery. And I mean, you're seeing it in people like Mary Harrington, who are finding their way back to faith, people like Paul Kingsnorth. There are people who are finding their way back to a world of mystery and depth, and are questioning the way things are. They tell me that the Orthodox Church is getting, in England, is getting large numbers of converts, though I fear some of them may be from Anglicanism, because we are kind of abandoning a whole DNA, if you like, for no good reason, and yet that does still attract people. And when you do put on very traditional rituals like the coronation, like the Queen's funeral, you do find people who are suddenly aware that there is a completely different world of the symbolic, which I feel is a world that we are fast losing, not just religious symbolism, but in a sense, if you lose a religious, you almost lose any sense that things can mean anything, that you can have symbols. Yeah. Physical things that speak. And I suppose
I have a sense that the whole loss of the symbolic does hang on the feminine. I almost think if for me, in any writing I would do, like if I was describing these people at that philosophy club lecture who just couldn't get it, I found myself when I'm trying to say like what they don't get, that I would say, especially on the whole issue of love and dating, I'd say like those people who don't know that a woman is more than just a woman, or that bread is more than bread. But the first one that comes to mind, if I had to go through a litany, would be those two things. A woman is more than woman, bread is more than bread. And, that's, again, kind of, we can hang our hat maybe and just, we stay on those hugely symbolic types, then maybe the symbolic order can come back. But you're right. I mean, it's fading so fast, Alison.
And I think that's absolutely right, Mike, about the feminine. I mean, until that's restored, I mean, that's why when the original subtitle for the submerged reality was something like ecology, economics, and ecumenism or something like that, because I thought, as I wrote, and I still think that the way forward is to restore sanity, and is for Sophia to come out of exile.
Well, I'm about to do a quiet, it's supposedly a quiet day tomorrow. It'll probably be quite noisy, on Julian of Norwich and the motherhood of God, but I'm going to talk about Sophia and the whole tradition of holy wisdom from the Old Testament onwards. There'll be the full Margaret Barker will get in there.
Oh, wow, great.
Not to mention some Bulgakov, as well as ideas of seeing Christ as a mother figure in Julian, and it's oversubscribed this day.
Wow.
And I do think people need to reclaim the divine feminine, because they need to have some sense of themselves as symbolic creatures, that we mean more than we are. And that has to begin from our physicality in all its different aspects, one of which is obviously our sex and gender. And to be able to have some kind of account of that, I don't see how you can kind of live without it.
Yeah. Another shorthand I use that brings in the divine feminine, I got from my novelist friend Stephen Bisanchi, who said, those people who confuse a woman's glance with saying she has 20/20 vision, right? So that brings in kind of intersubjectivity. Like when a woman gives you a glance, there's a lot of meaning behind that, but we're at least on campus, we're kind of creating these kind of automaton men who would say, like, Alison, she's made up of this much nitrogen, this much oxygen, and they're and like any woman is going to be so turned off by that glance, and of the, or the male gaze, the kind of the dissecting gaze, but this notion that we're creating a whole group of men who don't know when they're in the doghouse from their wife because they treated her discourteously. She gives you the glance. They could only describe the glance of a woman by saying, like, she has her prescriptions on her glasses or such and such, but tying a lot of these, the right brain, left brain, Ian McGilchrist, the technocratic world versus the poetic world. We need all these kind of shorthand terms. Then for me, the things that come up in conversation are usually tied to the feminine in some way,
Well, we need rituals, though, because I think Luce Rigore is right when, we don't know what woman is, if we don't know what man is, if we don't know what woman is, that they are these kind of poles,
right,
that kind of form each other. And if they are to be equal, then they both have to have full symbolic presence. But in society, you need to have rituals and customs which manage that distance.
Yeah.
And people have said, oh, well, for somebody to open a door for you is a kind of patronizing thing, and therefore let's get away with it. And now we've got a kind of world in which rape is absolutely, well, it seems to be very, very prevalent indeed. Not something, and I'm not saying that just having customs will deal with it, but you need to find ways of giving respect and honor to men and women. And we've kind of given up on that between old and young, between, and again, this is to do with the symbolic, that our actions need rituals if we are to find ways to be just and ethical.
I don't know if you saw it, Mike. I wrote a Substack this week. I don't even remember the title. It's this whole.
It's on the essentialism of men and women.
Well, it is. It is.
And I haven't read
in
it.
there, and you're talking about these symbols, and I think my experience. I love weddings, and my favorite moment in a wedding is at the procession where everybody's seated, and then the bride comes in and everybody stands. That's so profoundly moving and profoundly meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And you talk about, and I think, my father taught me to open a door for a lady, which is really a microcosmic picture of standing when the bride enters, right?
Yep.
And we live in a world where people are afraid to give the definition of woman or man. That's the strange thing about this. Is how did we get here?
But because the definition, I think, it inevitably gets into like DNA and so forth. But I think, Alison was talking about how they're mutually constitutive, right? But another way is gestures. That you were talking about Caitlyn Jenner. That if we, the great John Cowper Powys, and he has a book called The Art of Happiness, but it's the greatest 2 chapters. Like, how can a man live with a woman? And how can a woman live with a man? I think it's the greatest phenomenology of genders ever. But and there's not to say, none of us here are saying this wouldn't be found, but one gesture he uses of the feminine, which I know is true of my wife, and I see a bookshelf behind you, Alison, my wife will be, and I use with the college students, she'll be sitting, we're both sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden she'll stand up and she'll go to the bookshelf or the mantle and she'll move like a little trinket, like 1 inch to the left.
Yeah.
Then she'll come back and sit down, and then she's just very, I don't know, she's just really kind of happy. And so this idea that like women spin a cocoons around themselves, right? Men don't do it. We kind of, but these gestures of men and women, and I don't want to be heard as saying there's no man that would ever do it, but we could enter phenomenologically into Caitlyn Jenner's house and say like, I don't know, I'm going to bet at least $50,000 he never does it. And so there's gestures to the male and the female that we need to bring those back and to train people to look at these things, because it's quite beautiful. I would never do it. And when my wife does it, I say, that's really cool. It just was never occurred to me to stare at something for a long time while I'm reading, to get up and move something 1 centimeter to the left and go back and look so satisfied. Right.
You reminded me of this years and years ago when I first started as a Waldorf teacher. I went to visit my friend's house. His name was Mike. Everybody, I only know people named Mike. And he was a bachelor. So he was about 30. I was probably 24. And afterwards I saw a woman we both knew. I said, hey, I just was at Mike's house. And she said, her name was Irene. She said, so you saw his house? I said, yeah. No pictures on the walls. I said, yeah, I know, you're right. There were no pictures. He's not civilized. He needs a woman. Right?
Yeah. Look at the way bachelors live. They live Spartan.
That's the way she said.
They use one plate and plastic plates. They just live like that. Women would never, ever do that. And we need to like bring on awareness of this. There's a mental gesture too that I think is interesting. It's only, he'll say, think of your marriage to John, my marriage to Amy, and Mike's marriage to Bonnie. He'll say there's a mental gesture that like, men are afraid of the world. Julius Caesar went into the world wearing gauze because we use abstractions we use our ideas to kind of buffer us from the world. Women, he'll say, are kind of reality addicts, and then he said, what did he say next? Or did she say next? Anyhow, this kind of plays out too, that within a marriage, my wife, I have a conceited view of myself, I guess. And then my wife would defend that to the outside world, but then in the household of marriage, Bonnie could look at Mike and say like, Michael, you're not all that, and remind you, and boom, she can cut you down.
You've been spying.
Yeah. And then the male gesture is when they're having these kind of dance and so forth. There's something about the male psyche that said, I could die right now. Not that like you would get murdered, but like we could just throw the whole thing away, because women are intrinsically attracted to like life, right? Alison, you're a priest. You know as well as I do. I've been around so many dying people that the husband dies and the women will live a lot longer. The wife dies. A lot of husbands can just say, they're just sitting there and they can check out and they die like 2 weeks later. These are different things. The deathbed is very gendered, and we need to get the message out. And we're not saying any of this is without thousands of exceptions, but this stuff is interesting when you tell people,
I think you're right. I think we have to be careful when we do this.
We do.
We do it in a way that isn't open to people saying, well, these traditional ways of thinking that there is a way women inhabit the world, there's a male phenomenology, aren't culturally specific, because there is an element of cultural specificity.
For sure.
But you can't, well, of course, people are trying to get away from the tie between motherhood, giving birth, for example, which I think is, I'm not keen on. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well,
that there are things that do come from the fact that our bodies inhabit the world differently, and I think that there is a goodness in acknowledging that I do inhabit a room differently from the phenomenology in which my husband inhabits the room. The key is to keep those dynamic and not one is putting down the other, because
100%.
The other day I was teaching Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, to some students in a virtue ethics module. And I'm wanting to show that Aristotle's idea of human flourishing is by Jane Austen seen in terms of a marriage. That she sees this as a joint mode of human flourishing in a very companionate way. I could not get them to see this, even though the whole novel works towards the two characters have to get, in ethical terms, to a point where they're capable of this kind of complementary human flourishing. And it is, in fact, shown by the way that the garden is described and the way that they both inhabit the garden in slightly different ways. But my students will not accept this.
Yeah.
And they see
Again,
this
it's where that anthropology of competitive individualism enters the house.
yeah.
You know, the household, yeah.
That's right. They will not accept it. And yet I think that they are losing a huge amount by not doing so. So I think when we do articulate it, we have to articulate it in a way that is capable of a feminist reading, in the sense of a good feminist reading, which
Absolutely
honors the feminine and sees it as equal to the masculine. So though I do agree with you about all this, I just have to be a bit careful. I was very, very sad that these students could not accept that marriage could be this wonderful cosmic thing, which I do believe it is. And I think we stand up as the bride comes in to acknowledge the holiness of the earth, marrying the sky, if you like, or the moon and the sun. But, you know, they'd even say, oh, sun, moon, no.
I wonder if we can appeal to their laziness.
You know, cycles, women, you know, they go by the moon.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I always tell my own kids, so look at kids. The Bible starts with a wedding and ends with one.
Yeah.
And it's important.
I try to appeal to young people when they look at, and you tell me if you disagree, Alison, like one way to maybe help them see that is appealing to their laziness. And it's what Ivan Illich calls the rests of gender, R-E-S-T-S. You know, that in these, you know, simple anthropologically, he goes to these Swiss alpine villages and says that it was kind of an asymmetrical toolbox, and it shifted from valley to valley. But in one valley, the men might milk the goats, but never the cows and so forth. And what he called that was that in my household, my wife is never going to fire up the barbecue this year, but I'm never going to make a casserole. And so she doesn't make all the food, but there's a whole half of the world in our household that I don't have to worry about. Then it comes to nitty gritty, like when the kid is hungry and feeding and so forth. You know, my wife was the go-to person, but she could ask me to do anything, you know, in that world, but she was still the mistress of that world. And I would say yes. But one time she has everybody who comes over to our house, she always is telling the story that we have a vacuum cleaner. It was a new Dyson like 5 years ago. And maybe a year ago, she asked me to vacuum before some friends were coming over, and she was all harried and she was doing these things. And she caught me there and I was looking at it and I said, how do you fire this bad boy up? And she couldn't believe it. You know, and then, so she gets to tell everybody, they laugh at me. Apparently I do nothing. But then when push comes to shove, I would say, like, you would have no idea how to fire up the lawnmower or anything. But the larger poetry is, can we appeal to some people to say there's this way you could live with your spouse? It's not telling you which tools you can use, not in the longest way, but there's this dance of gender that, you know, that there's a lot of things that aren't your responsibility. It's wonderful. And it gives your wife, your partner, a sense of otherness, that there's this world that you find intriguing and so forth, you know, appealing to a sense of wonder, appealing sometimes basely to a sense of laziness, that when we lived in a small apartment, we used to, honestly, I'm not exaggerating at all, so many of the arguments around us were, I did the last load of laundry, it's your turn. I emptied the dishwasher last time, it's your turn. And I do think there's something to this, that we can create this mutual complementarity. Don't know.
Yeah, we each need our own mysteries.
We do.
For which we're responsible. Actually, a character who's always criticized as being highly conservative, but I don't think it's as conservative as he sounds, is John Ruskin, who of course wrote of Queen's Gardens and King's Treasuries. And his writing on femininity is about the link between woman and bread offerer, and to do with administration. Now, whether, as you say, these could be very different, these areas, mystery. We don't need to say, because you're female, you've got to be good at this, or you've got to be good at that. But there are these areas, and if you do own them, you're right. It makes life much more relaxing if you boss the other person around in your area of mystery. Because in fact, Irigaray goes back in her Ethics of Sexual Difference, goes back to the origin, isn't it? Aristotle, who says that everything originates in wonder.
Yes.
And in fact, we need to recapture. There will be inequality in wonder. And I'm sorry to bring Tolkien in after you've been rude about the distributors. And I accept everything you say about them.
Yeah, I love Tolkien.
Tom Bombadil and Goldberry represent, in a world in which, in the world of Lord of the Rings, marriage is not possible. Relationships between men and female, they've all become kind of separated. You know, what are the tree creatures called? The Ents will never find the Entwives. There is a kind of tragic world, but there is this paradisal world of a kind of complementarity, but equality between Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. And it seems to consist in poetry. He speaks only in poetry, and mutual gift giving. And in a kind of enchanted wonder between the two of them. It's very interesting to read.
It's also very interesting that Tom Bombadil and Cloudberry did not make it into the movie.
No, they didn't even make it into the BBC Radio 4 adaptation.
Really?
Huh.
I think so.
Talk about cultural analysis. Wow, that's important. But anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time, Alison. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
It was delightful, totally delightful, and
so
insightful.
Much.
Holy cow!
You give me speaking to you is always a blessing, and this really is. I mean, I feel my soul has been nourished,
and I've been lucky to be drawn into.
Seriously,
group.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I've
we
learned
hope to talk to you again.
I'm going to go away and look up Illick's resting.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's in his book Gender. He calls it the rests of gender. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image. Thank you so much, Alison Milbank, and thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. Maybe next week, Mike, we're going to be doing something of an anniversary show, and I might seed some people. If we do, even in the comments to this one, if you want us to answer any questions or if you want to propose, some topics that we should discuss, then maybe we can bring those up. So it's the first time we've done that, but send us your emails or in the comments about things you'd like to see or questions we could answer. And again, thank you so much, Alison, for your wonderful time today. And thanks for listening to the Regeneration Podcast.